A widow's courage defies a blizzard's wrath, carrying not just her children, but a wounded stranger through the frozen heart of Coyote Ridge. Mara Ellison, a young mother haunted by loss, faces a choice that could shatter her world or redefine it. In the brutal winter of 1878, her path crosses with a hunted man, sparking a bond that challenges hatred and fear. Will her defiance rewrite their fates, or will the snow bury their hope? Join us to uncover this tale of humanity in the harshest of storms. Subscribe, hit the bell, and share where you're watching from. Will you stay to discover what Mara risks everything for? The wind howled like a pack of starved wolves, tearing through Coyote Ridge with a fury that could strip flesh from bone. Snow fell in relentless sheets, turning the New Mexico Comanche border into a blinding white void. Mara Ellison gripped the reins of her gaunt chestnut mare, her knuckles raw beneath threadbare gloves. Her 10-year-old son, Jacob, clung to her waist, his small body shivering against her back. Strapped to her chest in a tattered blanket, baby Sarah whimpered, her tiny breaths warm against Mara's collarbone. They were 3 souls alone, fleeing the ghosts of a plague that had stolen Mara's husband and 2 older children, searching for shelter before the storm swallowed them whole. The trail was a faint scar through the valley, flanked by jagged rocks and skeletal pines bent under the weight of winter. Mara's eyes stung as she squinted through the snow, her heart heavy with the kind of grief that doesn't fade, but settles like dust in the bones. She'd promised Jacob they'd find a town, a warm hearth, a place to start over. But the storm didn't care about promises. It roared louder, drowning her thoughts, urging her to turn back. She wouldn't. Not now, not ever. Jacob's voice cut through the wind, small but steady. "Ma, look." He pointed to a dark smear against the snow, a trail of blood snaking toward a rocky outcrop. Mara's stomach twisted. She eased the mare forward, hooves crunching through the drift. The blood led to a figure slumped against a boulder, half buried in snow. A man, his bronze skin marred with bullet wounds, a broken bow at his side. His chest rose faintly, steam curling from his lips. A Comanche warrior, hunted, dying. His black eyes flickered open, meeting hers, wary, desperate, alive. Mara froze. The townsfolk called his kind enemies savages, their fear stoked by tales of raids and blood. She'd heard the stories, seen the wanted posters nailed to saloon walls. But those eyes weren't the eyes of a killer. They were human, pleading, clinging to life like hers clung to hope. She glanced at Jacob, his face pale, waiting for her to decide. Sarah stirred against her chest, a soft reminder of what it meant to protect the helpless. "Jacob, get the water," Mara said, her voice sharp despite the tremor in her chest. The boy hesitated, eyes wide, but slid from the saddle, digging the canteen from the saddlebag. He knelt beside the man, tipping water to his cracked lips. The warrior's throat moved, swallowing weakly, his gaze shifting between mother and son. No words, just the wind's scream and the faint rattle of his breath. Mara dismounted, her boots sinking deep into the snow. She unstrapped Sarah, laying her gently in a hollowed-out drift, wrapped tight in the blanket. Her hands shook, not from cold, but from the weight of what she was about to do. She knelt beside the warrior, his blood staining the snow crimson. He was heavy, his frame lean but solid, and every step she took to hoist him onto her back felt like defiance against the world that had broken them both. "Hold the reins, Jacob," she said, her voice steady now, a command carved from resolve. The boy obeyed, leading the mare as Mara staggered under the warrior's weight. His blood soaked through her coat, warm and sticky, a stark contrast to the ice biting her face. The storm pressed harder, snow swirling like a living thing, clawing at their clothes, their hope. Jacob's small figure trudged ahead, the mare's head bowed against the gale. Mara's legs burned, her breath came in ragged gasps, but she kept moving, driven by something deeper than fear, a need to prove that mercy still had a place in this frozen hell. They found the hunting shack just as the world turned white. It was a crumbling shell of logs and warped boards, barely standing, but it was enough. Mara eased the warrior to the floor, her arms screaming in protest. Jacob dragged in what wood he could find, and Mara struck a match, her last one, coaxing a fire from damp kindling and a strip of her own skirt. The flames flickered, weak at first, then grew, casting jagged shadows across the walls. The warrior's eyes followed her, silent, as she tore strips from her undershirt to bind his wounds. Blood seeped through, but it slowed. He was still here, still breathing. Jacob crouched near the fire, watching, his hands clutching the canteen like a lifeline. Sarah's soft cries quieted as the warmth spread. Mara worked in silence, her fingers steady despite the ache in her chest. She didn't know this man, didn't know his story, but she knew the look in his eyes. Loss, raw and unrelenting, the same as hers. The storm raged outside, but in that shack, a fragile truce took hold, binding 3 strangers and a child in a fight against the cold, the dark, and the world that waited beyond. The fire's faint glow painted the shack's walls in trembling amber, a frail defiance against the storm's howl outside. Mara knelt beside the wounded Comanche, her hands steady as she pressed a blood-soaked cloth against his chest. The air smelled of damp wood and iron, the tang of blood mingling with smoke. Jacob fed kindling to the flames, his small hands trembling, eyes darting between his mother and the stranger whose life hung by a thread. Sarah slept fitfully in her blanket cradle, her soft breaths a quiet rhythm beneath the wind's relentless scream. The shack creaked, as if the storm itself was clawing at the walls, testing their resolve. Mara's fingers worked fast, tearing another strip from her undershirt to bind a gash across the warrior's ribs. His skin was fever-hot, his breathing shallow, each exhale a faint cloud in the chill. She didn't know if he'd see dawn, but she'd be damned if she let him slip away without a fight. Her own grief, husband gone, children buried, had carved her into something harder than the rock of Coyote Ridge, but it hadn't killed her mercy. Not yet. She glanced at Jacob, his face pale in the firelight, watching her with a mix of fear and awe. "Keep the fire high, son," she said, voice low but firm. He nodded, tossing in a splintered board. The warrior stirred, his eyelids fluttering like moth wings. His hand twitched, fingers brushing the broken bow beside him, as if instinct still reached for a fight he couldn't win. Mara met his gaze, black eyes sharp with pain, but alive with something else. Defiance, maybe, or gratitude. No words passed between them, only the crackle of the fire and the storm's distant roar. She poured water from the canteen onto a clean rag, wiping crusted blood from his brow. His face was weathered, scarred, a map of battles fought and lost. Yet there was no malice in it, only a quiet strength that reminded her of the man she'd buried 2 winters ago. Jacob edged closer, clutching a stick he'd been poking at the fire. "Ma, is he gonna die?" His voice was small, but it cut through the silence like a knife. Mara's hands paused, the weight of the question settling in her chest. She wanted to shield him, to promise life where none was certain, but lies wouldn't serve him in this world. "I don't know," she said, meeting his eyes, "but we're giving him a chance." Jacob nodded, his jaw tight, and went back to the fire, stoking it with a boy's determination to do something, anything, to keep the dark at bay. Hours bled into the night. Mara worked by the firelight, cleaning wounds, stitching what she could with a needle and thread from her saddlebag. Her hands ached, her eyes burned, but she didn't stop. The warrior's breathing steadied, though each rise of his chest seemed a battle won. She caught him watching Sarah, bundled near the fire, his gaze softening in a way that made Mara's throat tighten. He saw something in the child, maybe the ghosts of his own losses. She didn't ask. Some wounds don't need words to be understood. As midnight loomed, the warrior spoke, his voice a rough whisper, like gravel underfoot. "Tahan." Mara looked up, her hands stilling. He tapped his chest weakly. "My name." "Tahan." She nodded, wiping her hands on her skirt. "Mara," she said. "That's Jacob, the little one Sarah." His eyes lingered on the baby, then flicked to Jacob, who sat cross-legged, watching with wide, curious eyes. A faint nod from Tahan, acknowledgement, maybe respect. The silence that followed wasn't empty. It carried the weight of two souls recognizing shared scars. The fire popped, sending sparks dancing upward. Mara boiled snow in a dented tin cup, adding a pinch of dried sage from her pack. She held it to Tahan's lips, steadying his head as he drank, wincing with each swallow. Jacob crept closer, his fear easing into something softer, something human. "Does it hurt badly?" he asked, voice barely above the crackle of flames. Tahan's lips twitched, not quite a smile. "Like fire," he said, his voice hoarse but clear. Jacob nodded solemnly, as if he understood more than a boy should. Outside, the storm began to wane, its fury softening to a low moan. Inside, the shack felt smaller, warmer, as if the fire had forged a fragile bond. Mara sat back, her hands bloodied but steady, watching Tahan's chest rise and fall. Jacob curled up near Sarah, his eyes heavy but fixed on the stranger. Tahan's gaze drifted to the ceiling, lost in thoughts Mara couldn't guess. The night stretched on, the fire their only shield against the cold and the world beyond, a world that would judge them, hunt them, tear them apart. But here, in this crumbling shack, they were just three people and a child, holding fast to the thin thread of humanity that kept them alive. The shack's fire burned low, its embers glowing like dying stars against the dawn's faint creep through the warped boards. Mara sat vigil, her hands stained with Tahan's blood, her eyes heavy, but unyielding. Jacob slept curled near Sarah, the baby's breath soft as sagebrush in the morning calm. Tahan's chest rose steadier now, his face less a mask of pain, but the weight of the world beyond the shack loomed larger as the storm's roar faded to a whisper. The silence felt like a held breath, waiting for the truth to break free. Morning light spilled through the cracks, sharp and cold, painting the valley outside in shades of frost and shadow. Mara stepped to the door, peering out at Coyote Ridge, its jagged peaks softened by the snow's retreat. The air was crisp, biting, but the blizzard had spent its fury. She turned back to Tahan, who stirred, his black eyes meeting hers with a clarity that hadn't been there last night. "You should go," he rasped, voice like dry leather. "They'll come." Mara's jaw tightened. She knew who they were. Soldiers, bounty hunters, men who saw a Comanche and thought only of blood or reward. Jacob woke, rubbing his eyes, and scrambled to his feet. "I'll get wood, Ma," he said, eager to prove his worth. Mara nodded, handing him the hatchet from her pack. "Stay close," she warned, her voice a quiet blade. The boy slipped outside, his boots crunching through the thinning snow. Mara busied herself boiling more snow for Tahan, her hands moving with the rhythm of survival, but her mind churned. She'd saved a man the world wanted dead. What that meant for her, for Jacob, for Sarah, she couldn't yet reckon. Jacob burst through the door minutes later, his face pale as bone. "Ma, riders," he whispered, voice trembling. "Soldiers, down the valley." Mara's heart lurched. She crossed to the door, peering through a splintered gap. A half-dozen men on horseback, their blue coats stark against the snow, rifles glinting in the dawn. One held a crumpled poster, its edges curling in the wind. Tahan's name was scrawled across it, Red River Chief, with a bounty that could buy a man a new life, or end one. She turned to Tahan, who'd propped himself up, pain etched in the lines of his face. "They're hunting you," she said, not a question. His eyes darkened, but he didn't flinch. "They always have," he said, voice low, steady. "Ambush. My people, women, children slaughtered. They pinned it on me." His words landed like stones in still water, rippling through Mara's chest. She knew loss, knew the way it hollowed you out, left you carrying ghosts heavier than any burden. "I didn't kill," Tahan added, his gaze locking with hers. "But they'll hang me all the same." Jacob stood frozen, the hatchet dangling in his hand. "Ma, what do we do?" His voice was a boy's, but his eyes held a man's fear. Mara's mind raced. Hiding Tahan was treason in the eyes of the law. Turning him over was a death sentence, for him, and maybe for the part of her that still believed in right over easy. She knelt beside him, checking his bandages, her hands steady despite the storm in her chest. "Why'd you stay out here alone?" she asked, needing to understand the man she was risking everything for. Tahan's gaze drifted to Sarah, asleep in her cradle. "To bring them home," he said, voice breaking like thin ice. "My sister, her son, buried under snow." Mara's throat tightened. She saw her own death in his words, her husband's fevered eyes, her children's still faces. She stood, decision made, no room for doubt. "Jacob, watch Sarah," she said, sharp but calm. "We're not done fighting." The boy nodded, clutching the hatchet like a talisman. Mara helped Tahan to his feet, his weight heavy against her shoulder. They moved to a corner of the shack, where she'd noticed a loose board in the wall. She pried it free, revealing a crawl space barely wide enough for a man. "In," she said. No time for argument. Tahan slid inside, his breathing ragged but silent, his trust in her a weight she hadn't expected. As the hoofbeats grew louder, Mara stepped outside, Sarah in her arms, her face set like stone. The soldiers were close now, their shadows long across the snow. She glanced back at Jacob, his small form framed in the doorway, and felt a surge of pride. If you're moved by stories of courage in the face of impossible odds, hit that subscribe button and share where you're listening from. It keeps these tales alive. Mara took a breath, ready to face the men who'd come to tear her world apart, knowing the truth she carried was worth more than their lies. The soldiers' shadows stretched long across the snow, their horses snorting clouds of steam in the dawn's bite. Mara stood firm outside the shack, Sarah cradled tight against her chest, her face carved from the same unyielding stone as Coyote Ridge. Behind her, Jacob's silhouette lingered in the doorway, his small hand gripping the hatchet, eyes wide with a courage too big for his years. The air crackled with tension, the valley's silence broken only by the creak of leather saddles and the soft clink of spurs. Mara's heart pounded, but her gaze held steady, meeting the soldiers' approach with a defiance that dared them to see past her lie. The lead rider, a captain with a face weathered by too many campaigns, reined his horse to a stop. His eyes, cold as the frost underfoot, scanned her, then the shack, then the tracks half buried in the snow. "Morning, ma'am," he said, voice clipped, like a blade drawn slow. "You alone out here?" He held up the crumpled wanted poster, Tahan's name scrawled in bold, the word, murderer, smeared by damp. Mara's fingers tightened around Sarah, the baby's warmth grounding her. "Just me and my children," she said, her voice steady as a taut rope. "Lost our way in the storm." The captain's gaze narrowed, flicking to Jacob, who stood frozen, the hatchet now hidden behind his back. "Tracks lead here," he said, nodding toward the faint hoofprints circling the shack. "Seen any Comanche? Man named Tahan, wanted for killing settlers." His men fanned out, rifles loose in their hands, eyes searching the snow for betrayal. Mara's mind raced, each second a step closer to discovery. Tahan was inches away, hidden behind a flimsy board, his blood still fresh on her hands. One wrong word, one stray glance, and the fragile world she'd built in this shack would collapse. "Only wind out here," she said, locking eyes with the captain. "And wind don't carry men." Her words were a gamble, sharp and deliberate, like a bullet aimed true. The captain leaned forward, his horse shifting under him, and raised a torch, its flame hissing in the cold. He held it close, the light dancing across her face, searching for a crack in her resolve. Mara didn't flinch, didn't blink, her gaze as unyielding as the mountains. Sarah stirred, a soft whimper breaking the silence, and Mara rocked her gently, using the motion to shield her fear. One of the soldiers dismounted, his boots crunching as he circled the shack, peering through the gaps in the boards. Mara's pulse thundered, but she kept her eyes on the captain, refusing to betray the crawlspace where Tahan lay. "You're a long way from anywhere, ma'am," the captain said, suspicion lacing his tone. "No husband? No kin?" Mara's jaw tightened, the question cutting deeper than he knew. "Lost them to fever," she said, voice flat, offering just enough truth to keep the lie alive. "We're headed to Santa Fe. Storm caught us." The soldier by the shack paused, his hand resting on the wall, inches from the loose board. Jacob's breath hitched, his small frame tensing, but he stayed silent, his trust in Mara absolute. The captain's eyes lingered on her, weighing her words against the weight of his orders. "We're hunting a killer," he said, holding up the poster again. "You'd do well to speak if you've seen him." Mara's lips pressed thin, her mind flashing to Tahan's words, his people slaughtered, his innocence buried under lies. She thought of Jacob, watching her, learning what it meant to stand for something in a world that demanded blood. "I told you," she said, voice like iron. "Ain't seen nothing but snow and wind." The captain held her gaze a moment longer, then nodded sharply to his men. The soldier by the shack stepped back, his hand falling away from the wall. Mara's chest loosened, but she didn't dare relax. The captain tipped his hat, a gesture more threatening than courteous. "Move on quick, ma'am," he said. "This ain't a safe place for a woman alone." He turned his horse, signaling the others, and they rode off, their silhouettes fading into the valley's haze. Mara waited until the hoofbeats were a distant echo before stepping back into the shack. Jacob rushed to her, his eyes wide with relief and fear. She knelt, pulling him close, her hand steady on his shoulder. Tahan emerged from the crawlspace, his movements slow, pain etched in every line of his body. He looked at her, his black eyes heavy with something unspoken, gratitude, maybe, or recognition of the risk she'd taken. "You lied for me," he said, voice rough as gravel. Mara met his gaze, unflinching. "Not for you," she said. "For my son, so he knows killing ain't the only way to live." Tahan nodded, a slow, heavy motion, and sank back against the wall, his strength spent. Mara glanced at Jacob, his small face set with a new kind of understanding, and knew the choice she'd made had changed them all. The valley outside was quiet now, but the danger hadn't passed. It was only waiting, biding its time beyond the ridge. The quiet of Coyote Ridge settled over the shack like a heavy blanket, the valley holding its breath as dawn broke clean and cold. Mara stood by the fire, her hands still, her eyes fixed on Tahan as he leaned against the wall, his strength ebbing, but his resolve unbroken. Jacob sat near Sarah, his small fingers tracing the edge of the hatchet, his face marked by a new weight, a boy learning too soon what it meant to choose mercy over fear. The soldiers' hoofbeats had faded, but their threat lingered, a shadow cast long across the snow. Mara knew time was slipping away, like sand through a broken hourglass. Tahan stirred, his black eyes meeting hers with a clarity that cut through the morning's chill. "I must go," he said, voice rough but firm, like stone worn smooth by a river. "They'll come back." Mara's chest tightened, knowing he spoke the truth. Every moment he stayed was a rope tightening around her family's necks. She nodded, silent, her mind wrestling with the cost of what she'd done, defying the law, shielding a man the world branded a killer. But she saw no killer in Tahan's eyes, only a man carrying the same ghosts she did. She helped him stand, his weight heavy against her arm, his wounds pulling with each step. Jacob watched, his gaze steady, no longer the frightened boy who'd seen blood in the snow 2 nights ago. "Stay with Sarah," Mara told him, her voice soft but unyielding. The boy nodded, moving to the baby's side, his small hand resting protectively on her blanket. Mara led Tahan to the door, where the mare stood tethered, her breath steaming in the frosty air. The valley stretched before them, vast and unforgiving, its peaks glinting like knives under the rising sun. Tahan paused, his hand gripping the doorframe. From his belt, he pulled a broken arrow, its fletching torn, its shaft snapped clean. He pressed it into Jacob's hand, his touch deliberate, heavy with meaning. "Keep this," he said, voice low, eyes locked on the boy. "Don't let them teach you to hate." Jacob's fingers closed around the arrow, his face solemn, as if he'd been entrusted with something sacred. Mara watched, her throat tight, seeing her son grow older in that moment, shaped by a truth she'd fought to preserve. Tahan turned to her, his gaze heavy with unspoken debt. "You gave me life," he said. "I won't forget." Mara shook her head, her voice steady despite the ache in her chest. "Go," she said. "Live." He nodded once, a gesture carved from respect, and stepped into the snow. His silhouette moved slowly but surely, fading into the mist that clung to the ridge, until he was gone, swallowed by the valley's vastness. Mara stood in the doorway, tears freezing on her cheeks, the cold biting deeper than the wind. Days later, Mara, Jacob, and Sarah reached Santa Fe, the mare's hooves dragging through mud churned by spring's first thaw. The town buzzed with rumors. A Comanche outlaw gunned down north of the ridge, his body lost to the snow. Mara heard the talk in the saloon, her hands tightening around Sarah's blanket as she whispered to her daughter, "He wasn't a monster, just a man, like us." Jacob, clutching the broken arrow, said nothing, but his eyes held a quiet fire, a spark of understanding that would guide him through the years to come. Time moved on, relentless as the seasons. Mara built a life in Santa Fe, stitching together work as a seamstress, her hands as steady with a needle as they'd been with Tahan's wounds. Jacob grew tall, his boyish frame hardening into a young man's, his path leading him to guide wagon trains across the plains. He carried the broken arrow always, a talisman against the hatred that festered in the hearts of men. Around campfires, he told the story, not of a fugitive, but of a mother who risked everything to save a stranger, a woman who taught him that mercy was stronger than fear. Years later, when winter winds howled through Coyote Ridge, travelers spoke of a light flickering in the valley, a lone flame dancing against the snow. They called it Mara's fire, a legend whispered among those who knew the tale, a woman who carried a warrior through a blizzard, not for glory, but because it was right. The story lived on, etched into the land like tracks in the earth, a testament to a moment when humanity held fast against a world that demanded blood. Jacob, now a man, would pause on the ridge, the arrow in his pocket, and smile, knowing his mother's choice had left a mark deeper than any storm could erase. Mara's fire still burns in the tales of Coyote Ridge, a testament to courage and humanity against a brutal world. What did her choice stir in you? Share your thoughts below. Where are you listening from, and what lessons linger from this story? Your reflections keep these narratives alive, connecting us across time and distance. We're grateful for your presence in this journey through the unforgiving West. Join us next time for another story of grit and heart, where the land itself whispers truths worth hearing. Until then, keep the flame of compassion burning.